What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Wildermyth. Just to give my usual spiel, I like to review games after 100% to set me apart from other YouTubers as well as lend myself some credibility. My Steam profile is public and listed in the description below. That said, these reviews do include more than just the achievements, and while they do, of course, include the achievements, if you're new to the channel and you click on my channel, the first video you should see is a video explaining everything I cover in these reviews. Now, with that said, let's actually jump into the review itself here. Now, Wildermyth is a very unique game, I would say. Functionally speaking, it is a procedurally generated tRPG, or a tactical RPG. Now, truth be told, it's not something I probably would have played on my own. However, it received so many recommendations from viewers that I decided to actually review it, of course. Now, I fully admit that my initial impression of Wildermyth in terms of the reason why I wasn't actually getting around to it was purely cosmetic, as shallow as that is, as I found the art style a bit off-putting. However, when you actually dive into the game, there's a very unique title here that I think is worth mentioning. So, broadly speaking, I think that the game very much so tried to lean into what a tabletop RPG tends to be, and that is a broad campaign. However, the actual nuance of the story comes from the characters and the stories that are being told therein. Because when it comes to the story of Wildermyth, while there are some campaigns that actually have stories, and there are, I believe, 6 of these, if you will, that are directly from the company as campaigns with content you can run through, it's worth mentioning that the campaigns themselves can also be approached as a generic or a legacy campaign, which we'll get into. But the main focus of the story is really what happens to the characters that you play through the game as, and you can actually play this game in multiplayer as well, which is important because a lot of games like this are frankly made better or enriched by playing them with someone who can engage in these character-driven stories with you. Before we go into that too much further, I do want to mention that of the main campaigns, a lot of them are okay for the most part. I would say that Aluna and the Moth and the All the Bones of Summer campaign were my personal favorites. I thought the actual story being told for the campaign was a bit above the others. However, again, the primary focus of the storytelling in Wildermyth is really about the story being told between the characters you are playing as. In and of itself actually also depends on the campaign you are playing, as some campaigns are known as legacy campaigns. This means you can carry forward previous characters into this campaign and actually start at a slightly higher level. Other campaigns for the story actually feature a bit of a mix where you will get some new heroes, but in some cases you can actually bring some of your legacy characters with you. So just in starting a campaign, there is a little bit of variance there. However, as you play through the campaign, or campaigns, your characters will be faced with events and changes and choices that will define their character. Now, rather than explain this too much, I thought the best thing I could do is actually give an incredibly unique example that happened to me in my first playthrough, actually. And that is in my, again, first campaign, one of my characters was prompted to choose whether or not to romance another character in the party, which I went ahead with because, again, there's a big legacy system where you can carry characters forward into games. Characters can have kids that then grow up and join your adventuring party, etc. So I wanted to engage with that system. So I had these 2 characters start a romance. Well, later on, 2 other characters in the party actually started a romance as well, which was all well and good. However, much later in the campaign, towards the end of it actually, there was an event with a bit of weird flirty dialogue between 2 of the married individuals, but with the other person's significant other. And then, a short while later, I was actually prompted with a choice where I could essentially break up these 2 marriages and pair off a character from each of them to then become a marriage in and of themselves, which I went ahead with because it was hilarious. But it didn't even stop there. This actually prompted a rivalry to form between the spurned and jilted lovers, which is another aspect of the game as well. In addition to things like romances, there are inter-party relationships of friendship or rivalry, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because everything I've just described to you does actually influence the combat through buffs as well. For instance, if a rival sees another rival crit someone, they will be inspired to do so as well. Whereas if someone sees their significant other damaged in combat, when next they hit that target, they will actually deal more damage. So overall, the storytelling in Wildermyth is genuinely unique, and I haven't seen anything quite like it. And the procedural nature of it would make you think that it would feel shallow, but surprisingly no, it feels in depth, like your characters are actually growing and changing as things and time pass them by. Because the other thing I haven't mentioned up to this point in terms of the gameplay itself is that while you're doing all these things, time is passing. Your characters will age. In longer campaigns, your characters will likely retire at some point, which will add them to your legacy heroes, if they aren't already, but also you won't be able to play as them anymore. All of which is pretty interesting. But all of that said, how does that actually translate into playing the game? Well, every campaign is either 3 to 5 chapters, and all of them take place on a procedurally generated circle map. Now, broadly speaking, the world of Wildermyth is known as the Yondering Lands. However, due to the time-passing mechanic, etc., they don't get really into like dates and lore and stuff, but just a general world setup. So on each of these procedurally generated maps, you'll start out with a small section of it in Chapter 1, and then throughout the campaign chapters, again 3 to 5, the map will slowly open up to you, and what you're going to do is take your party, scout new areas on this map, which will then lead to confrontations or fights. Before these fights, an event usually occurs, which then gives you character options, etc. Then, of course, you engage in the actual combat, and then once you've actually successfully taken care of the threat on a piece of land, you can then establish an outpost there, which will then give you materials at the end of a chapter which can be used to create better equipment for your team. So each chapter will have an overarching goal on top of this. Typically, it is finding someone or tracking something down, learning information, having a big fight at the end of the chapter, etc. But as I mentioned, time is passing. So what is that doing for the enemy? Well, this comes down to incursions and calamities. The enemy is growing in power if you rest on your laurels too much. Now, they actually will adapt to your strategy, as the game puts it, but basically this results in calamities. Calamities are essentially buffs to the enemy team. Every so many in-game days, depending on the chapter and the story, etc., the enemy will gain buffs through a card, essentially, that is added to their deck, which, again, is just buffs to the enemy. In addition, every time you win a fight with an enemy, they will also gain 1 calamity. The other thing going on is incursions. These take a bit longer to happen, but basically the enemy is actively trying to take over the map as well, and this is done through incursions, which is basically an enemy team doing the exact same thing you're doing, which is going around the map, taking things over, and you have to intervene and stop them, because the only way to really lose a campaign, outside of everyone just dying, is to have all of the map basically destroyed by an enemy incursion. So in addition to everything else going on, there is a bit of strategy in how you're approaching and handling the map as well. But from there, let's actually talk about combat a little bit. So when you're making your characters, each character can be one of 3 classes: a hunter, a warrior, or a mystic. These do essentially what you think they would do. A warrior is a warrior, a hunter is ranged or melee damage, but a little more mobile, and then a mystic is your mage of sorts. Now, honestly, combat in this game is relatively simple. It does manage to keep the bare bones of a tRPG system, but there are a lot of things about the combat that keep it very simple to learn and engage with, frankly. That's not to say it can't be difficult. There are difficulties where things like calamities will happen faster, the enemy has more health, more buffs, etc. That can make it a bit challenging, but overall, this is one of the simpler combat systems you'll see in a game like this, which makes it pretty approachable. However, what I'm not a fan of as much is the randomness attributed to the combat. Now, dice rolls and things like that are hardly anything new, and that is present. You do have % chances to hit based on a variety of factors, but what I'm talking more specifically about is the equipment and the actual abilities of each of your characters. So as you engage in combat and you level up, you'll get to pick abilities. However, the exact abilities that character can get at any given level are a bit random. Now, you can spend what are called legacy points to re-roll these options, which does help with that randomness a little bit, but legacy points are a currency, really, that are used to recruit new companions mid-campaign. They can be used as a currency to buy crafting materials if you don't have enough, but we'll get to that in just a second, etc., etc. But if the slight ability randomness wasn't enough, which can make it hard to actually nail down a specific build for a specific character, the equipment itself is also a bit random. So after fights, you can potentially get a piece of equipment to give to a party member. However, there's no inventory or equipment system, really. You'll give the equipment to that character, and then they just have it until it's replaced, and then you don't get to give the previous item to anybody else. It just gets overwritten, which on one hand is a simple enough system, but again, kind of makes it difficult to build a party in a very specific way. Now, even this is helped slightly along by their crafting system. As I mentioned, securing land, etc. gives you crafting materials that can then be used either on a tile that has a town on it, or at the end of every chapter, you'll be given an option to craft items. If you don't have enough materials, you can use legacy points to make up for it, which will then allow you to outfit your character with weapons and armor. However, you cannot craft every equipment slot this way, so it's impossible to fully outfit a team this way, though you can get the basics covered. Now, beyond those things, I did want to mention a few other things. As I mentioned earlier, there are character-related buffs that they will get based on their relationship with other party members participating in the combat, whether it's a romantic partner being hit or a rival criticaling, which is called stunting in this game, which is funny. So there's a lot of cool stuff even around the character storytelling that they managed to integrate into the combat, which I thought was a really nice touch. And then this is actually where I want to talk about transformation. So one of the things that can happen to your characters as they progress in age is that they will come across an event based on their character statistics, as well as what's going on in your party. They will have a chance to run into an event that will change them into something else. Be that something like a werewolf, a sort of fire elemental, a living plant, a crow, etc. There's a lot of these options, but all of these will actually also give that character combat options. And then this will start as a one-limb transformation. And then as chapters progress or a few other methods, it's possible for this transformation to actually then transfer to other of the character's limbs, which can give them unique abilities, etc., depending on what limbs are actually transformed, which is another pretty cool little element to combat. However, much like everything else, there's so much randomness to it, it's hard to track a lot of it down without just really hammering home the repetition part of the procedural generation. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we start hitting positives and negatives is how a lot of this RNG works. So basically every one of your characters will be assigned a bunch of personality traits via a number system. And best I can tell, the system actually uses these character traits of your entire party to then roll from a certain amount of set events that can then occur to that character. Some of this is random, some of it is highly specific, like the breaking up two marriages scenario I mentioned at the beginning of this review. Some of these events only occur in very specific cases with characters with very specific character traits. However, despite that, you will nonetheless see a pretty fair amount of repetition in the events and the storytelling after a while. So repetition can be a pretty big problem, but I do think that is a problem that is easily solved by mods and expansions. All of that stuff said, let's actually move on to our positives and negatives and then wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, the character storytelling is very good, and it works so much better than I thought it was going to, especially as a procedurally generated game, or at least largely procedurally generated. The inter-party drama and the things that are happening to your characters as they age and their life goes on and they eventually retire is very well done. In addition to that, this is a pretty relatively newcomer-friendly style of game. The combat is relatively simple. The randomness of things like equipment and abilities means that there's only so much min-maxing someone like myself can really do, and the focus very clearly isn't on that style of gameplay. Now, on the negatives, I'm going to list it here, but I admit it's really more of a neutral point, and that is the art style. While I don't think graphics are the be-all, end-all of video games by any means, I do think it's worth mentioning that ultimately this game has a very almost childish art style, and it can be off-putting, which is a shame because once you actually jump into the game, it's incredible in quite a few ways. But nonetheless, I do feel like that art style is putting off a potential user base, if you will, despite how good the game is. Now, my other big negative is the event repetition. Again, after a while, probably 20-30 hours or so, you will start to see a lot of these events repeat, which does take the magic away a bit from the actual storytelling, though again, this is a problem that can be solved by mods, etc. But essentially, there does come a point where you're seeing the same things over and over and over again. And then beyond that, the equipment and the ability randomness, I was not a huge fan of. Personally, I like a little more specificity with this type of things where I can actually manage them myself as someone who plays a lot of party-based tRPGs and cRPGs. I think managing that stuff to make you more effective at combat is a rewarding piece of it, though I admit, obviously, obviously that's not the focus of this game. But even as something that's not the focus, I don't feel like that sort of random element is fun, even though I realize this is procedurally generated, etc. But to draw a conclusion, Wildermyth is normally $25 on the Steam store, and for an indie title, I think that is a fantastic deal for the content you're actually getting. If you can buy this game on sale, even better. I actually bought it on sale myself for, I believe it was 15 or 16 bucks. Now that said, I do admit this type of game is not for everyone, simply because the focus is more on the character and role-playing aspects rather than the combat, which is what tactical RPGs tend to be about, which is the combat. I can definitely see why a game like this wouldn't be for everyone as a result, but I will say that for $25, if you choose to check this game out, it is well worth the money, and definitely gets a buy from me if you're thinking about it. I had a lot of fun with it, especially the storytelling, and I definitely think more people should check it out. There you guys go. There is my review after 100% for Wildermyth. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. The channel is growing every day, which I could not do without everyone helping out. Thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.